In the final year of the war, a quiet military transport route ran along the U.S.-Canada border. Most days, it was routine: trucks, paperwork, guards doing their jobs without questions. That changed one cold afternoon. A small group of foreign prisoners was being transferred north under U.S. military police supervision. The agreement was simple. Once they crossed into Canadian responsibility, U.S. authority ended. Everyone knew the rules. They were written, signed, clear. But authority, when unchecked, has a way of stretching itself. As the convoy stopped near a temporary holding area, a U.S. MP officer decided the prisoners were moving too slowly. Orders were barked. Voices rose. One guard shoved a man forward harder than necessary. Another laughed. The prisoners froze. Not from fear alone, but confusion. This wasn't the behavior they had been warned about in Canada. A Canadian liaison officer standing nearby noticed immediately. He didn't shout. He didn't rush. He simply watched, long enough to be certain this wasn't an accident. When the U.S. MP raised his voice again, the Canadian officer stepped forward. Calm, measured, firm. "Those men are under joint oversight now," he said. The U.S. MP barely looked at him. "They're still on our trucks," the MP replied. "So they're still our problem." That sentence hung in the air longer than it should have. Behind the officer, two Canadian soldiers quietly moved closer. Not threatening, just present. One adjusted his gloves. The other rested his hand near his belt, not on a weapon, but close enough to send a message. This was no longer about prisoners. It was about where authority ended, and Canada was about to make that line very clear. The air grew heavier after the Canadian officer stepped forward. No one moved. Not the prisoners, not the American MPs. For a few seconds, the only sound was the wind dragging snow across frozen ground. The U.S. MP finally turned, his voice sharp and irritated. "We're responsible for these men until the paperwork is finished," he said. "So, step back." The Canadian officer didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. Instead, he reached into his coat and unfolded a thin set of documents, already creased from the cold. "Joint transfer orders," he said calmly. "Effective the moment this convoy stopped." He pointed, not aggressively but precisely, to a line stamped in dark ink. "This ground is under Canadian control." That was when the tone changed. The American MP glanced behind him. Two of his men shifted uneasily. They had been trained to follow orders, but they were also trained to recognize when a situation crossed into something larger. Behind the Canadian officer, more soldiers appeared, not rushing, not threatening. Just standing in a quiet line, boots aligned, eyes forward. No weapons were raised. They didn't need to be. The Canadian officer took one deliberate step closer. "Your authority ends here," he said. "Not in 5 minutes, not after another command." He gestured toward the prisoners. "Now." The MP's grip loosened. Slowly. Reluctantly. The prisoners were guided back, this time by Canadian hands. No shouting. No pushing. Just firm, controlled movement. For the first time since the transfer began, the men breathed normally. The convoy would continue. But everyone present understood something had shifted. This wasn't a dispute. It was a line, clearly drawn, and crossing it was no longer an option. What happened at the transfer site didn't end when the convoy moved on. Within hours, a formal report was written. Carefully worded, precise, unemotional. No accusations, no dramatics, just facts, timestamps, and witness names. And it didn't go south. It went north. By the next morning, Senior Canadian Command had reviewed every line. The conclusion was quiet, but absolute. The situation hadn't been violent, it hadn't escalated, but it had crossed something more important. Protocol. A Canadian colonel arrived at the camp shortly after noon. No escort, no show, just a vehicle pulling up slowly, tires crunching in the snow. He met the U.S. MP commander inside a small office, bare walls, a single stove ticking softly in the corner. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. No shouting was heard, no raised voices, just one sentence spoken clearly and without emotion. This will not happen again. By sunset, procedures had changed. Joint transfers now required Canadian presence from start to finish. Prisoner handling was reviewed. Roles were redefined. Authority lines were rewritten in ink that could not be misread. The U.S. MPs complied. Not because they were ordered to apologize, not because anyone wanted a confrontation, but because they understood something fundamental had been demonstrated. Canada hadn't challenged America. Canada had simply reminded everyone where responsibility and restraint began. From that day forward, no MP questioned the boundary again. Not out loud, not on paper, and never on Canadian ground. The incident was never mentioned in speeches. There were no medals, no official announcements, no headlines. And yet, it quietly reshaped how two allies worked side by side. In the weeks that followed, U.S. convoys moved differently when they approached Canadian oversight. Orders were repeated. Hands stayed where they belonged. Voices stayed low, not because of fear, because of respect. Canadian officers didn't patrol with raised tempers or dramatic authority. They simply stood where they were meant to stand, visible, calm, immovable. Their presence alone reminded everyone that responsibility did not belong to one uniform. It belonged to the ground beneath their boots. The prisoners noticed the change first. Transfers became silent affairs, controlled, predictable. The uncertainty vanished. What replaced it was something rare in wartime movement: clarity. Years later, when veterans spoke about cooperation between the two forces, this moment was rarely described in detail. But it was remembered, not as a confrontation, not as a dispute, but as a moment when restraint proved stronger than force. One Canadian officer's decision to step forward, without anger, without threat, had drawn a line no one dared test again, not because it was written, but because it was enforced by principle. And on that frozen ground, in that quiet moment, Canada had said everything it needed to say. Not on my watch. The incident was never mentioned in speeches. There were no medals, no official announcements, no headlines. And yet, it quietly reshaped how two allies worked side by side. In the weeks that followed, U.S. convoys moved differently when they approached Canadian oversight. Orders were repeated. Hands stayed where they belonged. Voices stayed low, not because of fear, because of respect.